Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. It is a beautiful day outside. I know all of y'all are so glad that fall is here, just like me. I love seeing these leaves changing color, and it is interesting that that leads into what we are studying tonight. We are in the middle of Dr. Claypool's book, Glad Reunion, where we look at different people in the Bible. There are so many people in the Bible that we know very little about, but there are some that we know a whole lot about. And tonight we're going to talk about the person of Joseph. Imagine your life being documented in the Bible the way that Joseph's was. Literally the last third of the book of Genesis, chapters 35 up through the 50s, are devoted to this person. So you kind of have to ask yourself, why was it that his story was so important? And really, the essence of it is that we see this transformation in him. He changed. And this is so important to what we believe. Jesus said that what we bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What we loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. In other words, this attitude that we have about whether or not people can change literally has eternal implications. So this is critical to what we believe as Christians. What do we believe about the possibility of people actually changing? Well, what is the general kind of attitude about it? The general kind of attitude is kind of a leopard can't change his spots kind of mentality. In other words, the only measure of someone's future is their past behavior. And of course, that's true to some extent. I believe the best indicator of someone's future behavior is their past behavior, but it is not the only indicator, and it certainly is not absolute that it has to be that way. He says the past is only one measure of a hopeful future. He says if one buys into such a conclusion that people cannot change, it's easy to see how despair and hopelessness can become the prevalent attitudes towards even yourself or other people. This kind of hard-hearted cynicism can dominate your mind. That is a kind of way of losing faith and hope. He says they no longer believe that a human being could become anything different than what he or she had been. Well, what does the Bible say about the possibility of human change? He says what we find when we look there is utter realism coupled with powerful hope. It never speaks of human change as something easy or automatic or painless. However, it does hold forth the hope that change is possible. Listen to how he words this. This is just beautiful. He says, the Bible even goes so far to say that God is always to be found working on the side of changing people for the better. I dare you to show me one place in all of human scripture, in all of Holy Scripture, where God comes to a person and commands that one to stay as he or she is. God never comes to someone in the Bible and says, I just want you to stay where you are and keep doing what you're doing. He is always calling people into the future to partner with him to change for the better. He says the Bible calls us to approach all people, ourselves and others, from a stance of hopeful realism or realistic hope. We are not to be naive or assume that we as humans are on some kind of escalator that is automatically lifting us up to perfection, but the biblical message is that change is possible. Now, this is something where most of us were kind of raised with this idea that we're supposed to give people the benefit of the doubt. That sounds nice, but it really is not realistic. What should we do? Well, we look at the evidence one way or the other. We shouldn't just give someone the benefit of the doubt. We should look and see exactly what is happening and let that guide what we say or do next, but be open to the possibility of positive change. Well, nowhere is this seen better in the Bible than in this person of Joseph, who we get to see his whole life from beginning to end. Here he is, he begins by being the favorite child and nothing is asked of him, so it's not surprising that he becomes an adolescent that was just insufferable to the whole family except his father. And he's given this, what we have heard as a coat of many colors. It actually translates as a coat with long sleeves. What does that mean? That because you have long sleeves, you're not doing any work. It's a lounging kind of thing. And it was very much reflective of how his father treated him and also treated him differently from the rest of his sons. So much so that one day all the other sons are out there working in the field, and he says to Joseph, I want you to go out there and check on them to make sure that they're working. Well, as you can imagine, it was just the straw that broke the camel's back. All these years of pent-up frustration just came out, and they decided they were going to tear him from limb to limb. Literally, were going to kill him. Ultimately, some cooler heads prevailed, if you could call it that. They didn't take his life. They threw him in a pit, and it just so happened that a group of Midianite traders came by, and they sold him into slavery. Horrible thing to do, but it did spare his life. They then took his coat with long sleeves and dipped it in blood and took it back to their father and said that he must have been devoured by some wild beast. And you can imagine the grief that his father went through when this was brought to him. That's going to be important to the end of the story. Well, what happens? He gets sold into slavery and literally undergoes this radical change. Why? Because was it just because he was forced to work from now on? No, it was that something was finally asked of him. He was finally asked to do something, and it brought forth something that was within him that he had never been asked to show. He says, before long, Joseph had risen to the top of all the servants and was then brought into Potiphar's house. This was obviously a very powerful man, and lo and behold, his wife, Potiphar's wife, tries to seduce Joseph. And when he does the right thing and refuses her advances, she did what so many people do in life, projecting what they do on somebody else. She accuses him of trying to seduce her, and he ends up back in prison. One little curious thing about this point in the story to me is this. I mean, he was a slave, and he was accused of coming on to this powerful man's wife. Why was he not killed for that? My personal opinion, I think Potiphar knew the truth and knew his wife, but he had to save face by doing something. So he sends him back to prison, but he continues to do whatever he can with what he had. And lo and behold, he develops a reputation for being able to interpret dreams. And word gets back to Pharaoh. Pharaoh calls him up and asks him to interpret his dream, and he was so impressed by what he was told that he literally put him in charge of everything else. So he eventually became the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. And that by itself shows that change is possible. But what happened next was really just mind-boggling. Years go by, there's a famine in the land, and lo and behold, Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt to, in effect, beg for food. And of course, they don't recognize Joseph for who he is, but he recognizes them. And then he puts them through a series of tests. Why? He could have just given them a dose of their own medicine. That's what normally happens to people. But because Joseph had changed, he wanted to see if they had changed as well. And so through a series of events, he in effect threatens one of them to be put in slavery, waiting to see if the other brothers would take up for him. And not only do they do that, but the very brother who had sold Joseph into slavery is unwilling to allow his father to go through that kind of grief again, and he offers himself to go instead. Literally, the one who had sold Joseph into slavery was so changed by everything that had happened over the years that he was willing to offer himself up instead. Incredible part of the story. Dr. Claypool says it soon became clear that these persons who had once lashed out at their father for his favoritism now had a new kind of concern for him. And instead of treating Benjamin the way they had once treated Joseph, they treated him with tender protectiveness. He says this then is the biblical answer to the question, can people really change? It is possible. It is not inevitable or painless or easy, but infinitely possible. And this is the stance of hopeful realism or realistic hope that we are called to assume in the world. Hopeful realism, not just benefit of the doubt, not pessimistic that no one could change, but realistic hope. Realistic hope. Hopeful realism. That is such a great way to put it. You know, this reminds me so much of my teaching days. I obviously enjoyed it very much. So one of the things I enjoyed the most was seeing the change in the end. I've got a couple stories that I want to pass along to you. One morning, I'm doing hall duty, which teachers love to do, right? So I'm sitting in the hall, grading papers or something, and I look up, and this kid, who was a big kid, but he was young, he was 14, he was like a freshman, out of nowhere, sucker punches this other kid. And I jump out of my seat. I grab him. I'm wondering if he's going to try to sucker punch me. And he didn't. I took him to the office, but it was just out of nowhere. There was no exchange of words or anything. It just stood out in my mind. Well, a couple years later, he ends up in my class. And so that's the only thing I've got in my mind is this is the kid who sucker punched this other kid out of nowhere. So I'm on the lookout for him all this time. And I realized it was so out of his character. I got to know him. And so finally, at the end of the year, I said, man, do you remember the day that you did that? And he goes, yeah, I remember. I said, tell me what happened. And he just said, I don't know. I don't know. You know, and I didn't force him to try to tell me any more than that. It probably something was going on in his home that caused him to lash out in some way. But the truth of the matter is, he was completely different than I had assumed by that one action. So we have to be aware of our perception. The other story I want to tell you is I had this kid. He was obviously he was a smart kid. He just would not do his work. And in my class, if you didn't do your work, it was just not happening. You know, all my students would tell each other, you have to do your homework in this guy's class. And so I worked with this kid, and he ended up failing my class. And I'll never forget, I only had this happen in all my years of teaching one time. This kid came up to me after school, and he said to me, I want to apologize for failing your class, and I just want you to know that it's not that you didn't get to me. You did. I just still failed your class. And I was so proud of that moment, recognizing he wanted me to know that there had been change there, even though it had not showed up in his grade. And I thought that was such a great thing to experience. You know, the truth of the matter is that people can fail forward. You don't hear that kind of talk very much, but it's the truth. We can fail forward. We can use what has happened to us as a way to do better in the future, even if it is a failing kind of thing. Dr. Claypool ends by saying, the Bible is always to be found on the side of hope. Can we call ourselves followers of such a one and do anything less? Remember that Jesus said, what we bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What we loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And what that means is that what we believe and put into action about changing people is eternally important. I hope this Bible study has found you well. Continue to pray for our church family. I'm so grateful for our church family. I'm so proud of how everyone is getting through this. We will get to the other side of all this, but until then, pray for God to continue to guide us and protect us until we can meet again. Go in peace.